Government drama llama ding dong and a book recommendation. I've brought up this book before, but I want to point out certain passages in it, and that is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which was first published in 1905. The story focuses on a Lithuanian family and one of the main characters being Jurgis. I'm not going to give his entire character development or backstory, but I want to point out a few passages and ways that his character changes, and maybe one of you out there will want to read this. And it just seems like a random, completely arbitrary time to bring this up. I'll kind of skip around in the text, but feel free to get this from your local library, or you can get this online for free. One of the things they talk about in this book is how they would pick certain workers. Jurgis was confident of his ability to get work for himself unassisted by anyone. As we have said before, he was not mistaken in this. He had gone to Brown's and stood there not more than half an hour before one of the bosses noticed his form towering above the rest and signaled to him. Basically, he gets the job because he looks like he is strong and he is able to get it done. Jurgis' dad, Antinous, and I'm not sure to say that name, but somewhere in the old yards he was begging for a chance to earn his bread. He had been a worker ever since he was a child. He had run away from home when he was 12 because his father beat him for trying to learn to read. And he was a faithful man, too. He was a man you might leave alone for a month if you only had to make him understand what you wanted him to do in the meantime. And now here he was, worn out in soul and body, with no more place in the world than a sick dog. He had his home, as it happened, and someone who would care for him if he never got a job, but his son could not help thinking, suppose this had not been the case. So after all, there was a crack in the fine structure of Jurgis' faith and things as they are. The crack was wide while, not sure to say his name, was hunting a job, and it was yet wider when he finally got it. He had come home in great excitement with the tale that he had been approached by a man in one of the quarters of the pickle rooms of Durham's and asked what he would pay to get a job. He had not known what to make of this at first, but the man had gone on with a matter-of-fact frankness to say that he could get him a job, provided he were willing to pay 1/3 of his wages for it. Was he a boss? The old man had asked, to which the man had replied that he was nobody's business, but he could do what he said. Another point that is made multiple times in this story is that people often get their jobs because of the misfortune of others, whether they get injured or something happens to them or they fall ill. One day a man slipped and hurt his leg, and that afternoon, when the last of the cattle had been disposed of and the men were leaving, Jurgis was ordered to remain and do some special work which this injured man had usually done. It goes on to describe what that work was, and this book does also go into all of the gory detail of what working in one of these factories and canneries and all these different places is like. At the end of this paragraph, when he came home that night, he was in a very somber mood, having begun to see at last how those might be right who laughed at him for having his faith in America. Jurgis starts out with the mindset that a lot of people had, where I'm big and strong and I can do this job and I can get paid, so I don't understand why other people can't. And piece by piece, he starts to realize why it is that these places are dangerous. It's not long after this that he starts to learn what unions are, and he starts going to every meeting. They were often very turbulent meetings with half a dozen men declaiming at once in as many dialects of English, but the speakers were all desperately in earnest, and Jurgis was earnest too, for he understood that a fight was on, and that it was his fight. Since the time of his disillusionment, Jurgis had sworn to trust no man except his own family, but here he discovered that he had brothers in affliction and allies. What I like about this section is at the end of this paragraph it says, he forgot how he himself had been blind a short time ago, after the fashion of all the crusaders since the original ones who set out to spread the gospel of brotherhood by force of arms. Remembering his mindset at the start of this book, he now realizes that he was wrong in the way that he was viewing things, and now he has this fervor to go and try and get other people to understand the reality. Also, the Union made another great difference in him. It made him begin to pay attention to the country. It was the beginning of democracy with him. It was little state, the Union, a miniature republic. Its affairs were every man's affairs, and every man had a real story about them. In other words, in the Union, Jurgis learned to talk politics. In the place where he had come from, there had not been any politics. In Russia, one thought of the government as an affliction like the lightning and the hail. Duck, little brother, duck, the wise old peasants would whisper. Everything passes away. And when Jurgis had first come to America, he supposed that it was the same. He had heard people say it was a free country, but what did that mean? He found that here, precisely as in Russia, there were rich men who owned everything, and if one could not find any work, was not the hunger he began to feel the same sort of hunger. As the story continues on, different members within Jurgis' family get injured or they lose their job, or like a factory closes, there's all sorts of stuff that happens. Such were the cruel terms upon which their life was possible, that they might never have nor expect a single instant's respite from worry, a single instant in which they were not haunted by the thought of money. They would no sooner escape as by a miracle from one difficulty than a new one would come into view. In addition to all their physical hardships, there was thus a constant strain upon their minds. They were harried all day and nearly all night by worry and fear. This was in truth not living, it was scarcely even existing, and they felt that it was too little for the price they paid. They were willing to work all the time, and when people did their best, ought they not be able to keep alive? One of the things that happens is that Jurgis's wife is essayed by her supervisor multiple times. This upsets him, so he goes and he basically assaults her supervisor, ends up in jail, and then eventually he is let out. Once he is out of jail, he starts looking for another job. At the beginning of the story, he was a worker that looked strong and healthy, whereas now, the particular bitterness of all this was that Jurgis saw so plainly the meaning of it. In the beginning, he had been fresh and strong, and he had gotten a job the first day. But now he was second-hand, a damaged article, so to speak, and they did not want him. They had got the best of him. They had worn him out with their speeding up and their carelessness, and now they had thrown him away. Him and these workers had been overworked and underfed for so long, and finally some disease had laid them on their backs, or they had cut themselves, and blood poisoning or met with some other accident. When a man came back after that, he would get his place back only by the courtesy of the boss. To this there was no exception, save when the accident was one for which the firm was liable. In that case, they would send a slippery lawyer to see him, first to try to get him to sign away his claims, but if he was too smart for that, to promise him that he and his should be provided with work. This promise they would keep strictly and to the letter for 2 years. 2 years was a statute of limitations, and after that the victim could not sue. I'll end with the thoughts that Jurgis has as he is in prison. Jurgis stood upright, trembling with passion, his hands clenched and his arms upraised, his whole soul ablaze with hatred and defiance. 10,000 curses upon them and their law, their justice. It was a lie. It was a lie, a hideous, brutal lie, a thing too black and hateful for any world but a world of nightmares. It was a sham and loathsome mockery. There was no justice, and there was no right anywhere in it. It was only force. It was tyranny, the will and the power, recklessness and unrestraint. He had no wit to trace back the social crime to its far sources. He could not say that it was the thing men have called the system that was crushing him to the earth, that it was the packers, his masters, who had bought up the law of the land and had dealt out their brutal will to him from the seat of justice. He only knew that he was wronged and that the world had wronged him, that the law, that society with all its powers had declared itself his foe. And every hour his soul grew blacker. Every hour he dreamed new dreams of vengeance, of defiance, of raging, frenzied hate. And at that point in the story, it's only about 2/3 of the way done. This may have been published in 1905, but much of it is still true today.